Well, welcome everybody. I'm delighted to have everybody back here again for another BECC webinar. And we're going to get started in just a moment here. Let me start with a little introduction. So today's webinar, of course, is Theories of Change for Encouraging Climate-Friendly Behaviors. Our webinars are brought to you by the BECC Conference, Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change. And this year we'll be in Washington, D.C. and online. My name is Reuven Sussman. I direct the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, also known as BECC. And I co-chair the BECC Conference, or Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change. Here in DC, we're all about acronyms, so BECC and BECC is how we talk about it. This year's conference theme is Engaging All Voices, and we are really excited to lean into this topic with a new DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion advisor that we've hired. We can't quite tell you about our new keynote speaker, but you're going to love her. But it's all about engaging all voices this year. And if you register now, you get the early bird prices. And this year we have special early bird pricing, extra special for 501c3s, nonprofits, and universities. So check that out and go to the website to see all the content there. Just a note about how the conference is structured this year. It's a little bit different, so I wanted to let you know about it. We have a virtual opening day, which is your virtual conference, which if you've come the last 2 years, you know what to expect. Full interactivity, but you're online and you're at home. But for the first time in 2 years, we're also back in person in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol Hilton, where you get to meet all the BECC folks. And for those of you who are veterans of BECC, you'll see all your friends again. And so you can register for the full experience, the virtual opening day and the in-person event, or you can register just for the virtual opening day if you're interested in that. But I look forward to seeing everybody there, where we'll be talking more about this kind of topic that you're hearing about today. These are our sponsors, and without the sponsors, of course, we couldn't make the conference a reality, and we couldn't make this webinar a reality. So I sincerely thank all these sponsors. And if you want to be a sponsor, check out email info@beccconference.org, and we can set you up. It looks like we have a great attendance so far of 136 people. So if that's the kind of exposure you want, let us know. Next webinar. Before I get to this month's webinar, I want to tell you about next webinar on July 21st. It's going to be titled Leaving No One Behind in the Energy Transition. And our speaker will be Pamela Fan, who is our DEI advisor for BECC this year. She's also the founder and CEO of Integrated Solutions, LLC. Not quite, the registration page isn't quite online yet, but you can check out beccconference.org to make sure you stay updated with that. So for this webinar, we're doing something different and very exciting. It's not just a webinar. Don't just sit there and expect to sit back and enjoy yourself and listen to people talking. You are going to be doing some talking today, and that's why we're especially excited about it. So that said, please remain muted during the first part. I think actually you will be prevented from speaking, but when it comes to breakout rooms, we do encourage you to turn on your webcam and unmute and discuss things in the small groups that we've arranged. Throughout the entire session, though, use that chat. It looks like people are already using that chat. And thank you, William Prindle, 15th anniversary of BECC. Yeah, I'm excited to see people chatting about what you're hearing throughout the discussion, throughout the webinar, and we'll use that to keep an eye out for questions throughout as well. We will be doing small group breakout sessions, but I'll let our speakers talk more about that. And that brings me to my next order of business, which is introducing our speakers from RARE. Today's topic is Theories of Change for Encouraging Climate-Friendly Behaviors. I'm going to first turn it over to Kaylee Williamson, who's the manager for learning and tools at RARE's Center for Behavior and Environment, but she'll be joined with Rahim Rahimov, who's the Senior Behavior Research Associate at RARE's Center for the Behavior and Environment as well. So without further ado, Katie, please share your screen and take it from here.
Great, thanks, Reuven. Hi, everybody. Gonna get our slides up here. All right, hopefully everybody's seeing that okay as we get started. Perfect. So as Ruben mentioned, I'm from RARE. I'm here with my colleague Raheem, and we're really excited to be with you today to talk about theories of change. So objectives of this session. So we're hoping you come away with an understanding of the importance of having a really strong theory of change and help really doing a bit of a deep dive and how we can even strengthen the ones you might already have. We're going to identify elements of what we call a psychosocial theory of change. And I promise to define that and demystify it as we go through. And then, as Ruben mentioned, we're really hoping to make this pretty interactive today. So we'll have you actually apply learnings to a real world case of household solar adoption and play a bit with this idea of building your own psychosocial theory of change. So here's our agenda. So we'll share a little bit about what we do at RARE and our Center for Behavior in the Environment. We'll take a deeper look at theories of change and program evaluation, share a real world example in our coastal fisheries program, and then we'll do a breakout session with this case of household solar adoption, kind of having some discussion and questions and reflection, and then close from there. So we've got a packed hour for you all. So as a little bit about RARE, we've been really focused on community behavior change for a long time. Our headquarters is in Arlington, Virginia, but we work mostly globally in addition to having a kind of climate change program based here in the US. And so human behavior is really core to the problem and solution for environmental challenges. And that's a lens that we really bring to our work. And we've been around for about 40 years, partnering with communities of all kinds to inspire behavior change in many special places. So today our work is primarily focused around coastal fisheries, sustainable farming, and climate change. And the Center for Behavior in the Environment is RARE's behavior change hub. So we both support our internal programmatic work as well as advising and doing trainings and other engagements with external organizations on environmental behavior change. So getting a bit into our frameworks as we go into thinking about behavior change and theories of change. So we really see evaluation and design as closely connected. So this is an image of our behavior-centered design journey, which are the steps that we use at RARE to design behavior change programs. I imagine many of you may have seen similar frameworks or ones that have similar steps from design thinking and behavioral science or behavioral design strategies, and ours is really combining a lot of those frameworks. So we start with, framing the problem, understanding actors and behaviors, then gathering data on our actors to understand, what are their motivations and barriers, developing hypotheses and mapping to behavioral insights, ideating and prototyping and testing solutions, and ultimately launching and assessing. And this approach is really iterative and nonlinear, which will become incredibly important when we talk about the adaptive management that we need to do in program design and evaluation. So I put this up just as a reference. If you're interested in this particular approach, we do larger trainings just on learning about this, but just going to put it up here as a reference for the design work of behavior change. I'll also mention these, which are our levers of behavior change. So this is our kind of behavioral science framework at RARE that we use to categorize different motivations and barriers. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on this today, but just wanted to mention it because as we talk about these psychosocial states, which are the beliefs and attitudes and social context that are behind our behavior change theories of change, we use this framework to help us do that. So with all of that being said, let's talk a little bit about theories of change and program evaluation. So in the process of developing these programs at RARE, we've learned a lot about what's necessary to achieve change and how to measure it. So I'm putting up these ingredients as different things to keep in mind as we are developing and thinking about evaluation. So first off is just our goals and objectives. So what do we want to know? What kind of impact or process or engagement are we interested in terms of developing a program? we also have those outcomes. So what are those main environmental or social outcomes that we want to achieve? We also have indicators. So this is, how do we know that we've achieved our objectives? What is the behavior that we want to change? What are the beliefs, attitudes, or contexts that have changed? What social factors have changed? So this is the part we're really going to dig into next on how do we know that things are changing and how do we know that our program is working? And then we also have monitoring and evaluation. So this is how we are both evaluating that the program that we've put in place has generated results. So thinking about randomized control trials or pre-post evaluations or qualitative interviews, as well as monitoring. So how are we looking at change over time? So these are some different elements of program evaluation that I'm sure many of you are really familiar with. And today we'll really be focusing particularly on the outcomes and indicators part of this. So thinking about these typical theories of change, many organizations and many of you may have developed a theory of change for a program or even a project that you're working on. And at its core, a theory of change is this directional flow diagram that really illustrates the relationship between activities, outputs, or maybe behaviors in this case, and those larger social or environmental outcomes. So while this is a really good start and has some of those core elements, it also can assume these critical psychological, social, or behavior changes. So as many of us, on the call, when behavior change is really important to us, we really care about the why, and what's going on in that kind of black box that our activities are doing that's leading to behavior change. So as a result, we've designed the psychosocial theory of change, which is kind of another way of thinking about like a really behaviorally informed theory of change, where we take the time to make really explicit what are those psychological and social indicators, such as beliefs or attitudes or social states that are changing to lead to that behavior change, and laying it out in this directional flow diagram. So the more explicit that we can be, it allows us a greater understanding of why our program is working, and also allows us to really rapidly kind of adaptively manage what might be going well and might not be going well. So we can make those changes throughout instead of at the end of the program when it might be too late to make any pivots in our approach. So I want to demonstrate this type of theory of change with one of our programs at Rare, which is called Fish Forever. And this program is really trying to work on helping communities manage their coastal waters in places like Indonesia or Brazil or the Philippines, so that they can sustain these fisheries for many generations. And one aspect or one behavior that this program is really focused on is getting fishers to not fish in a protected reserve area. So respecting these particular regulations. So I'm going to go into a theory of change that's particularly about that behavior. This theory of change is based on an existing theory of the theory of cooperative behavior. So many of you may have heard of cooperative behavior, cooperative dilemmas, which is where we need a lot of individuals to be coordinated in doing a behavior. And it often also requires them taking on some sort of personal cost for the greater good. So in the case of fishing and fishing in a particular area, each fisher has to choose to fish less than the maximum amount that they could to sustain the fishery and avoid this tragedy of the commons situation. So we've mapped out this theory, the set of 3 phases that really helps us map out what are the beliefs that need to change among fishers to respect fishing regulations. So we, again, won't go into a ton of detail on this, and we have a particular resource that really goes into a lot more detail on this theory and how it applies to this fishing work. But I wanted to show this as it helps to explain the thinking behind the psychosocial theory of change that I'll show. So this set of beliefs progresses from building demand about how important it is to respect these fishing regulations. Then the social expectation part comes in of, well, I actually think other fishers are going to also respect this regulation. And then finally strengthening that existing norm. So this sense of like, well, if I don't follow this, people are going to know, or I might get caught. And so this theory really sits in the background of this particular theory of change. So here is an overview of what this looks like. And you can move kind of left to right and bottom to top, and you can see how certain activities are connected to different beliefs and behaviors and outcomes. So I'm going to break this down row by row to show you kind of how this is developed before we go and practice starting to build one of these on our own. So these are high-level program outcomes. You might remember when I was talking about some of those key ingredients for evaluation. This is kind of our top line. So the Fish Forever program is really at the core, it's really about increasing and improving community livelihoods and also increasing fish stocks. So those are the main things that we're focused on for this theory of change. Next, we see this layer of behaviors. So the main target behavior is having fishers not fish in this reserve or protected area. But you'll note here that there's a few other smaller behaviors that support it. We often find that with a kind of main target behavior, there are some micro behaviors or sequence of others that need to happen in order for this other one, this main target behavior to occur. Next, we have these psychosocial states. And this is just a kind of fancy way of talking about the beliefs or attitudes or social context that we want to expect to change for those behaviors to change. So we might have beliefs about fishing in this protected area being wrong. We really need people to believe that it's the right thing to do to not fish in this area. And then finally, we've got those activities. So these are the parts of the program that we're really rolling out or implementing that lead to this domino effect of those beliefs changing and then those behaviors changing. And so we might have things that are really popular in in these communities we work in are, these interactive games or gatherings. Public pledges are really powerful, particularly with local governments to signal that there's support for these new regulations. In addition to enforcement patrols. So this is a good way for us to help communities support these existing norms. And the final thing I'll mention here on this theory of change is these enabling conditions. And these are going to be different for every theory of change. But in this case, something that we've found helps to make this successful is this sense of high collective efficacy and trust, as well as that kind of homogeneity or sense of community that's in a place, because that really helps to create these shared belief systems. So we mentioned those because those can be really important, and we'll see those as also being really important for the case we'll share with you all soon. One other element that I want to mention when thinking about a theory of change is this idea of dynamic programming. And you might remember I was talking about how we can be adaptively managing our programs. And that helps us to answer, how do we know when this is working, or how do we know when to move to that next activity and to sequence things in time? And that's where we can use this tool to help us get live data about decision-making and the program delivery so that we know when to kind of stop and start different parts of the program. Popular tools for this can include text messages or short surveys or interactive voice responses with sample members of the community, and that helps us learn about what's really going on as we roll out these different parts of the program. So in the theory of change that I just showed, we might launch this series of community gatherings or games and activities, and then be monitoring that first behavior and the beliefs here that I've outlined in green to make sure that those have really shifted before we introduce this next activity. So as a result, by getting that feedback, we can make sure that we are moving through this theory of change in a way that's actually generating results as we go. So I know that was a lot, a speedy overview. And we're going to now kind of digest all of that through doing an activity together where you get to play with your own theory of change. But if you just have to remember one slide of everything that I've just talked about, a psychosocial theory of change and dynamic programming really help us to, one, design a more targeted program with really targeted activities that address these motivations and barriers. It helps us define really explicitly these psychological and social states, as well as what needs to be done in what order to change behavior. And finally, it can really help us track key indicators that signal behavior change. So I'm going to pause just for a minute before I turn it over to Raheem, just to see if there's any burning questions. I am looking at just the chat here as well. If you have any questions, feel free to also drop them in the chat. I'm just going to do a quick review. And Raheem and Reuven, if you noticed anything, feel free to mention it, and I can try to answer it now before we move on.
Sure. Owen Howlett asks, you mentioned the enabling condition of high within community homogeneity. When utilities are trying to promote our programs, they're trying to reach very different kinds of people. Some people are easier to reach than others and expect are going to need a lot of help adapting the programs to harder targets than they currently reach. Are there what approaches could help with that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, those enabling conditions are going to be very different depending on the case. So I hear you on that. I think there are going to be some identifying which barriers are, like in the solar case we're about to talk about, where if there's no ability to access solar, it's not present in a community, that might be a pretty strong barrier to launching a program in that particular place. So trying to find a community or a particular area where this is at least possible or accessible is going to be at least something to ensure before we start those programs. And we'll talk about that more. I'm curious as we go into our activity, what others kind of brainstorm. But I don't know, Raheem, if you have any other thoughts on that too.
I think when we say within community homogeneity, we also talk about the psychosocial states and the state of the belief. So when we think about, for example, believing that fishing is wrong in the reserve, we want to have some sort of consistency across the community. That makes shifting that belief much more easier because the community is at the same level for that belief. But Katie, I think your point about every community having different enabling conditions is super relevant.
That's great.
There's also two other points here. I don't know how many you want to get into here, but a couple of folks have commented, Phil Nowotny said he's surprised about the emphasis on pledges in this particular example, and maybe they're more effective in a small community. And then Tom Cabot responded that maybe, a pledge can be my city government is pledging to no longer install fossil fuel equipment and municipal equipment replacement. Do you have any thoughts on the use of pledges?
Yeah, I guess a quick note is we found, particularly for these, for like community leaders and local governments, for them to pledge that they are committed to supporting communities and their management of these resources, we found that can be an incredibly strong signal for creating this new norm. So that could be unique to this particular case, but yes, those public, particularly pledges, have been quite effective.
Yeah, and that's what Anne Gallagher or Tammy Mills notes as well, that the publicness is important. Do we have time for one more? Or there's like a long two-part question here, or should we move on?
I think so. Just a couple of things I'll say just on, I think a couple that are walking into these kind of more of the methodological questions to get into those motivations and barriers. And while we don't have time to go much into that design process, if it helps to know, the behavior-centered design process that I briefly mentioned is where we do a lot of that surveying and interviewing and really gathering a lot of the data that feeds into the psychosocial theory of change. So as much as possible, this is being based on data that we gather and not assumptions or preconceived notions about a particular set of actors in a community. So I think really want to emphasize that kind of empathize step that we have is super important to make sure that we're building a theory of change that's really reflecting the reality on the ground. So hopefully that helps with some of the other questions coming in, and then we'll go in. I think we're going to just transition to the activity to make sure we have time for that. But as these questions continue to surface, we'll have more time at the end of the webinar. Really appreciate all the thoughts and questions today. Okay, Raheem, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Katie. We would like to spend the rest of the session learning about our case, which is going to be about household solar adoption, and building our own theory of change. Instead of focusing on fishing behavior, our behavior is going to be solar adoption. We picked this behavior because as BECC webinar attendees, we thought this might match your interest more closely given the variety of backgrounds in energy, technology, policy, and everything that's at the intersection of that. We also picked solar adoption because of our separate program, Climate Culture, which is tasked with testing and developing behavioral solutions to addressing climate change in the US. And we learned through rigorous research and climate impact modeling that installing rooftop solar is one of the most impactful environmental behaviors that Americans could do to reduce their emissions. Before we actually go and practice building our theories of change, we wanted to set the case on the behavior. From our primary and secondary research, we know that the majority of people understand the environmental benefits of rooftop solar. From market and government data, we also know that the cost of solar has been drastically falling. In fact, it fell by more than 70% in the last decade. However, at the same time, the number of homes with solar has unfortunately remained mostly unchanged, as you can see on this graph. And at RARE, our working hypothesis is we're not seeing this change because most programs do not target the relevant psychosocial states, motivations, barriers, or emotions in their program design. And this is why today we're advocating for building better theories of change that put psychosocial states really at the front and center. We also wanted to provide the groups, the teams, with a rough timeline and steps associated with getting solar. While installing solar panels is just our final target behavior, as Katie mentioned, there are many multiple mini behaviors, micro behaviors with various time commitments that often support our final behavior. When someone is thinking about getting solar on their roof, the first step usually involves determining whether solar is suitable for their home. This can be done online and can take as little as 1 day, sometimes even hours, if you're using something like Google Sunroof. Assuming the house is suitable for solar, the homeowner might then decide to look for solar installers in their local area, contact them about their lead time, and start scheduling evaluations. And this process can take anywhere between 1 to 4 weeks. The next stage usually involves these installers arriving on site to someone's home, looking at the roof, doing the calculations, checking the area, sun exposure, roof angle, and so on, and really evaluating whether solar is a reasonable choice for that household. The next step is the installer or multiple installers, if the person decided to get comparison quotes, gives them a quote, which includes the cost of solar installation, as well as the production of solar, or how much energy are they expected to get from solar and any expected seasonality over the years or seasons. And finally, if all their stars align, the final step is hosting installation and inspection, which depending on availability of the solar installer and the complexity of permits takes 2 weeks to 1 month. So we will be using these mini or micro behaviors when we are developing our theory of change in a minute, but we also encourage the teams to really think through what other behaviors you think are relevant at what stage in the process. When we go into the breakout rooms, we will be doing interactive activity between small groups of people. And we realized that this is a webinar. So if you have arrived here thinking that this is more of a lecture, participation is encouraged, but it's definitely not compulsory. So we encourage you to be as comfortable with this engagement as you would like. But what we will be doing is really a 4-step approach in this activity. First, we'll ask the teams to review our list of actor behavior pairs, psychosocial states, activities, and enabling factors that we will provide to you. We then ask you to add any additional elements from your experience or your background knowledge. Finally, determine the sequences. What goes first? What follows? What is last? How are these connected? And finally, put these ingredients together to assemble your psychosocial theory of change. Each group will have a mural board to complete these steps. And Mural is an interactive platform, and we will be looking at that and doing a very brief introduction to that in just a second. But before we do that, we wanted to share with you some of the starting items or ingredients for your theory of change organized into these 5 main buckets. These buckets are program outcomes, actor behavior pairs, which we already saw on that timeline. It's psychosocial states, program activities, and enabling conditions. I won't be going over program outcomes and actor behavior pairs because I think those are a little bit more clear. Instead, I will narrow down on psychosocial states. The states that you see here are developed by our team through internal brainstorming session, design thinking sprints, as well as primary and secondary research. And from where we're standing, we see that these states need to be shifted in order to get someone to adopt solar. For example, one of those steps is believing that installing solar is the right thing to do. Another state is believing that people in your reference network are installing solar. And when we say reference network in social psychology, that usually means a group of people whose opinions you value and you care about. Another state might be believing that people in your reference network or people that you care about think that you should install solar. So those are beliefs about what other people believe. And finally, a couple more, which is believing that you can install solar, so you're capable or you're able, which sometimes you see references self-efficacy. And finally, believing that you can afford to install solar. When coming up with program activities for this exercise, we looked into a Solarize campaign. I think many of you may have heard of Solarize, which is a behavioral and psychology-driven approach that has been extremely successful in getting people to adopt solar all across the US. And here are some of the key activities that they use in this campaign. One of them is solar workshops and Q&A sessions. And those are informal community events where people gather together and really learn about solar from each other. Another activity might be live solar installations. And those are really celebratory hurrah events where communities gather together and celebrate their neighbor or their friend installing solar on their roof. And this is an extremely important activity because, as you might guess, it affects the psychosocial state really directly. And finally, you might have solar open houses or solar tours at the ambassador's house. The ambassadors in the context of Solarize are the people in the community that are knowledgeable, well-respected, and have solar. So they are really, really strong messengers of getting solar. And the open house usually involves informal get-together at that person's house, discussion of solar, looking at their utility bills, and really just learning firsthand from someone that has solar. Finally, some enabling conditions that we find relevant are solar contractors in the area, presence of solar adoption or ambassadors, viability of solar in geography or sun exposure, as well as the housing type, where single family homes are most relevant, apartments, not so much. What we would like to do next is show you just a few slides of what you will be seeing when you join a breakout room session. So every single team will see 2 murals. One of them will be with the sticky notes. Think of them as digital sticky notes with the ingredients that you just saw on the previous slide. So you're able to move them, you're able to copy them, you're able to create your own new ones. The second mural is where we will be working or ideating as the team. So the task is to drag those stickies into this second psychosocial theory mural, arrange them in the right order, arrange them in the right rows, and see if you can have enough time to see if you can build connections, build the arrows, and see how the states or how the activities, they fold and inform each other. When we join the breakout room sessions, every team will have a mural board. The number on the mural board will correspond to the number in your Zoom breakout session. Because we have quite a few people, you may have to scroll down onto the web page on Mural to really find your working, where you'll be working. And finally, once you do find that mural, you can zoom in using the magnifying glass on the top, on the bottom right place on the web page to zoom in on your mural and work there. As a recap, these are the steps that we will be taking. We realized that competency with mural will be very different for different people. So Katie and I will be hopping between different room sessions, breakout sessions, and assisting you with any questions. This part of the session is as interactive as you would like. We definitely encourage the teams to unmute themselves, get the video going, and really work together. But if you're hoping to just sit back and listen, that is definitely okay as well. And I can see Katie has already posted a mural link into the chat. At this point, we're going to pause for just a minute to see if there are any questions about the case or how to use Mural.
Great, and I'm seeing a lot of really excellent expertise being shared in the chat, which is not a surprise given the attendees of this group. And we really invite you to bring that into your discussions. So even if you don't get a chance to start really building or build a complete psychosocial theory of change, even just having discussion about the kinds of states or activities or even enabling conditions. There's been some really great enabling conditions being shared in the chat as well. And the chat will stay with you as you go into those breakouts, so feel free to reference that as needed. But we look forward to hearing about your discussions when we come back in about probably around 8 minutes or so we can also wrap up together. But we will send you off to breakouts. If Nick, you can do that for us, and we'll see you all in a bit.
The breakout room should be open now.
Great. Is it okay if we pause the recording just for this section?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I know that was a really quick amount of time. I know Raheem and I jumped in quickly to hear some of your conversations, and it was really awesome to see everyone engaging with the mural board. So thanks for doing that. Whether you were just brainstorming some states and some elements, or actually starting to build something. I'm going to turn it over to Raheem, who's just going to show you an example of what one of these might look like if you were building it out. So I'm going to share my screen and turn it over to him.
Oh, thanks, Katie. Yeah, I really enjoyed jumping between the breakout sessions, even though I got to spend just 45 seconds to a minute with each team. But here's what an example of a product might look like. I know many of yours look similar, some look different, and that's great. When I am thinking about enabling condition, it helped me to bucket these conditions into 3 different groups. The first one, I call them psychological or behavioral enabling conditions. And that is including people that are respected about and knowledgeable about solar in the community, presence of solar in the community, as well as the campaigns, behavior change campaigns that are highly visible, both in person and online. My second bucket of enabling conditions is, I think what I call structural, which is just getting enough sunshine on your roof or having the relevant type of housing. And finally, the last one is what I think is really external enabling conditions. And I saw a couple of groups really touch on that as well, which was great, which is having state and federal incentive programs, how easy or difficult it is to obtain the permits, which I saw in the chat. Many were sharing it takes months and months because of COVID. And finally, having multiple trustworthy solar contractors or installers in the area that can really help decide who to go with. Instead of looking at the entire psychosocial theory, I'm going to narrow down on just that first column, just highlighted in red. My activity begins with solar ambassadors or people that are knowledgeable about solar in the community, canvassing their neighbors and friends, going door to door and warming up people to the idea of solar, get them talking, get them excited. And if that activity works, then I expect a shift in the psychosocial state, which is just above that. And I expect installing solar to be a salient part of people's decision-making context. When I say salient, it means just top of mind. So people start thinking about solar. Because what we know from research is most people don't even think about installing solar panels. And finally, when we see that shift in a mental state, installation becomes salient. Homeowner assesses their solar suitability. So they might use Google Sunroof Project or some other tool to peek and learn if solar might be a good choice for them. As you can see, there are multiple connections and contingencies and dependencies in this map. But unfortunately, we don't have a whole time to get into it. We will be sharing this PDF to the people on this call after the webinar.
Great. Thanks, Raheem. I know, yeah, we could spend a long time walking through this, and I'm sure there's also, this is just one way to share this. There's a lot more based on a lot of the elements you all added, and we could, yeah, make this a much longer and more complex theory of change for sure, with all of the various components and the geographic considerations that I know some of you were bringing up, and just the difference in communities and access to these resources. So I'm gonna bring us back to our presentation just to close out the session in our remaining minutes here. So give me a quick minute to transition, and we'll do that. All right, so in our remaining minutes here, and I know, we could discuss a lot and really welcome your thoughts in the chat as we do this. I'm going to put actually both reflection questions up here as we close our session today. It's just thinking about what really surprised you or was your biggest takeaway from today's session. Could even be something that you are still thinking about or curious about, and we'd love to hear that in the chat. As a way of kind of reflecting on and discussing what you've heard today and what you've been working And if that's related to how you might use tools from today in your current work or other projects, we'd love to hear that as well. I'm seeing some support for doing this for heat pumps, which would be really interesting. If you want to share some of those reflections with us in the chat, that would be great.
There was one comment that I thought was clever or insightful from Bob Guimarin, who notes that we need to engage more than just renters, more than just homeowners, because some high percentage of 34% of US households are renters. So we're not going to get where we need to go without engaging everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's really interesting to think about how we might connect these different theories of change, just because we recognize that the behavioral, barriers and motivations are going to be different for different actors. So how might we connect this from homeowners? There might be a different one for renters. There might be a different one just for even getting local governments to support solar incentive programs. So there's a whole network of theories of change that we can envision, and zooming in really particularly in this area.
In the same vein, William Prindle notes that we should be focusing more on organizational behavior because it's easier to change the behavior of organizations, which I think is possible, but that's arguable. Although I do see your point. And B, that there's more energy being used by the commercial industrial sector. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so our program with climate culture that Rahim mentioned is really focused at the household and individual level. So that's where we've been focusing a lot of our energy. But I think the focus on organizational behavior is also super important. It's not as much as we've been focused on, but I think there's absolutely value in working at different levels of the system. So it's a yes, and even though it's not exactly what RARE is focused on right now. Yeah.
There's a few comments in here just saying that this is a great way of thinking about things and I haven't done this before. And I think that what's really noteworthy here is that this is a framework. You can take this, not owned by RARE. You don't have to pay RARE to use it. You can just do it now. You have the tool. Use it for your problem, whatever it might be.
Awesome, thanks. And we really appreciate everyone's working with Mural with us. I know that was a massive mural to try to navigate. We were really thrilled by the turnout from today, but also know it was maybe a little challenging to do in the time. So thanks for your experience, your patience and ability to jump in. And appreciate all the notes in the comments here. I know there's a lot more we could talk about, but we are rapidly running out of time. So let me. I just wanted to mention before I turn it over to you, Ruben, that if you want to learn more about our work at RARE, I'll just share a couple links in the chat. And if you're interested in learning more about the climate culture program, if you're interested in learning more about our team at the Center for Behavior and the Environment, I'll also drop that link in there. And then we have a quick survey on today's session, if you wouldn't mind sending this out, and we'll also send it in the follow-up email. But this is just to give us some feedback about what you liked about the webinar and what we could be doing differently and your interest. So please feel free to share some feedback with us. And just a thank you from me and Rahim on your engagement today. So I'll turn it back to you, Ruben. Thanks.
Yes, and sorry for cutting you off like that. And sorry for cutting off this amazing webinar that's going so well. I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming out. Remember that next month, there's another free webinar, Leaving No One Behind in the Energy Transition. And this is really going to be squarely focused on our BECC conference theme, which is engaging all voices. If you haven't yet checked out BECC, go to beccconference.org. And if you register now, before July 31st, you'll get the early bird rate. And I highly recommend taking advantage of that and checking out what we have on that website. Thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.